We are people of compassion and we are people of law. But there is nothing compassionate about the failure to enforce immigration laws.
The U.S. Trump administration announces it will cancel a program that protects young, undocumented immigrants. And the international community condemns a nuclear test conducted by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Hello, I'm John Terrett, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Trump administration and its U.S. allies were challenged once again this week when the DPRK conducted its most powerful nuclear test yet. The Korean Central News Agency said the hydrogen bomb test ordered by leader Kim Jong-un was a success. The latest test took place in breach of UN sanctions and increased tensions between Pyongyang and Washington, D.C. China has strongly condemned the test and is calling for dialogue. Well, joining us now in the studio is Maria Pena. She's senior political correspondent with L'Opinion here in Washington, D.C., the newspaper. Also with us is Brian Becker. He's the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition and has traveled as a journalist to the DPRK many times. From Tampa, Florida, we're joined by the author and commentator Dan Perkins. And my colleague, CGTN White House Correspondent Jessica Stone, joins us on the panel as well. Welcome to you all.
Thank
so
you.
The DPRK conducts this hydrogen bomb test over the weekend. We're told it's the biggest test of its kind anywhere in the world ever, bigger than Nagasaki and Hiroshima put together. Maria, when you woke up on Sunday morning and you saw the TV coverage, what did you think? What ran through your mind? Did you think this is a game changer for the world? Or did you think, really, at the end of the day, nothing's really changed?
Unfortunately, I tend to go with the latter. I think it's more of the same rhetoric and the game, unfortunately, a game of rhetoric between the two, between the U.S. and North Korea, because, you know, it's a political power struggle. And to me, sometimes it seems like they're just playing a game of who blinks first. And the danger to that, of course, is that sometimes President Trump is unpredictable. We don't know what mood he's going to wake up in. And, you know, a lot of people are concerned that he may wake up one day and decide he's going to push the button and it's going to be very catastrophic for everyone involved. So obviously, people are reacting cautiously. China's calling for dialogue because what else can you do? I mean, can you threaten to do military strikes? And what are the consequences of that? You know, for every action, there's a reaction. So I think people really do need to sit down and look at what the options are. We know that sanctions haven't really done anything there. They don't feel threatened by more sanctions. Right. The UN can do as many resolutions as they want, and that still doesn't change anything. So I'm really not very optimistic about what really can be done other than to keep pushing the Korean government.
Brian Becker, take us into the mind of the North Koreans. You've been there many, many times to the DPRK as a journalist. Nikki Haley, who's the ambassador for the United States to the United Nations, came out with what I thought was an extraordinary, very clever statement yesterday. She said that Kim Jong-un was begging for war. Do you think he's begging for war?
No, I think Nikki Haley may be running for president in 2020, so trying to get a little notoriety to use provocative statements like that. North Korea has endured a war. Between 1950 and 53, 4 million Koreans perished. That's almost 1 out of every 5. There wasn't one structure taller than one story still standing in North Korea because U.S. bombers had leveled every part of the country. The main complaint of American pilots at that time was there's nothing left to bomb. So no, North Korea is not begging for war because they know the horrors of war. What North Korea is doing against the most important, largest military power in the world that twice a year simulates the destruction of North Korea once again through war exercises is saying to them very predictably, they always say Kim Jong-un is unpredictable. He's not. He's been saying, we're going to achieve a nuclear deterrent so that you can't attack us once again. And the only way to do that is to have a nuclear technology and a missile technology capable of reaching Americans so that all the bleeding won't be done on one side. So North Korea has looked at Iraq, they looked at Libya, the countries that gave up weapons of mass destruction, and those countries were invaded and their leaders were killed. And North Korea is saying, that's not going to happen to us. These are defensive measures. So what should America do? Not provoke, not threaten them, not say the fire and fury is coming at you. What it should do is say, let's go back to the negotiating table. Let's have bilateral talks. Let's end the Korean War once and for all. I mean, all wars have a beginning. All wars, except this war, have an end. This war should have an end.
But the problem with that, though, is that for the U.S., allowing them to have a nuclear weapon or nuclear ambitions is non-negotiable.
Well, I think the U.S., if you go back to the 1950s, they said Red China could never have nuclear weapons, that it would be something that would be unacceptable. But guess what? America finally got to accept China as a nuclear power and, in fact, establish diplomatic and even friendly relations. So I think it can be done.
And there are those who would argue that that's the playbook that the DPRK is following, too.
I think it is.
They want to go exactly in that regard. And Iran is watching as well how DPRK handles all of this.
And where does it stop?
Well, I think it could stop with the DPRK agreeing to a freeze of its nuclear program. In other words, don't make it stronger, don't make it bigger, don't have greater missile technology in exchange for the beginning of a normalization of relations. I think the DPRK is willing to do that. In fact, they offered it for the last 3 years. They said, we will suspend our missile programs and nuclear tests in exchange for a moratorium on war exercises. Obama said no twice, and then Trump said no in January. Why not say yes?
Dan, let's bring you in Florida. Dan Perkins, author, commentator. Everything that we're being told in America by cable news and other outlets is the opposite, really, of what Brian and Maria have just articulated. Do you think that the military option is further up the scale than Brian and Maria are suggesting?
John, I have to thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. I think that part of the challenge is that how can we trust that the North Koreans are going to say and do what they say they're going to do? The history is not positive. When Mr. Clinton negotiated the settlement where they got 2 nuclear reactors and $5 billion, they told us after they did their first test of nuclear device 4 years later that they were basically working from the day they signed the agreement, so we can't trust them.
Well, Brian,
the young lady who was...
Brian, let me let Brian answer that point. Well, it's a reasonable point that he makes, isn't it?
No, it's actually not reasonable because, one, the 1994 General Framework Agreement, which he's alluding to, said that DPRK will suspend its nuclear weapons program in exchange for heavy oil shipments and the creation of 2 light water nuclear reactors. In other words, reactors that can't create plutonium. The U.S. never dug the first ditch, never opened up those plans. So 7, 8 years later, after the United States didn't fulfill its part of the 1994 General Framework Agreement, DPRK, and this was after George W. Bush said a DPRK is part of the axis of evil with Iran and Iraq, then the DPRK said, guess what, we're canceling our commitment to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we're going to start building nuclear weapons.
Okay, Jessica Stone, White House Correspondent. Go on, Dan, yes, go ahead. You deserve a chance to respond.
But President Clinton admitted after they signed the agreement that one of the most difficult parts of that had yet to be settled was the verification that they were doing what they do. They refused to do it. My point is that we've had lots of discussion, diplomatic discussions, and I don't think that that's going to work. I wrote a piece today on Newsmax of where I've talked about what we need to do is move away from all this sanction and do a total embargo of North Korea.
Well, let's bring in 5 ports. Jessica Stone.
That's very close to what the president articulated in his tweet over the weekend, isn't it?
Jessica, you are our White House correspondent. You're in and out of the West Wing all the time. You know what they're thinking in there. And I believe that you think that they want to try and resolve this using trade as a weapon. Is that right?
Well, that's certainly what I've had a senior administration official articulate, that they're looking to use trade with China in particular and the U.S.-China trade relationship to squeeze China, to squeeze the DPRK. I don't think that that's something we haven't sort of picked up on with some of the increasing tensions in the trade relationship.
But when I look at the West Wing, I wonder really if they have a plan for this. It seems to me very confusing. Donald Trump puts out a tweet. General Mattis, the defense secretary, will say something tough. But do you think there's an actual plan that they work work?
I see Treasury
towards?
and Commerce lining up things that they can levy against the Chinese in particular. If you see the Chinese and the Chinese alone as the only tools, which a lot of people don't. But I think this administration is looking to work with China closely on that, and they think they'll be able to do that better if China has some incentive with the trade relationship. The problem is that at the same time, I have Chinese officials telling me, you know, hey, this is sort of something we're getting used to from this president. This is the way he talks, and it's not like the U.S. is ever going to stop doing business with all of the countries that trade with the DPRK, especially with China. I mean, it's a huge trading partner for the United States. It would undermine the entire global economy.
Maria?
And also, I was going to second that in the sense that I don't think China is going to go along and just sit there and take it. I think it's going to be counterproductive for the U.S. as well. I don't think China is going to sit there and allow this sort of a trade war of sorts. I think it's a lose-lose proposition.
Dan is dying to get back in Florida. Dan, let's bring you back in.
93% of the exports of North Korea go to China. The total aggregate value of exports in a 12-month period is equal to 38 hours of export from China to the United States.
Well, yes, but what China, I think, wants is stability over anything else. And it may have made a decision that it's done what it can regarding Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang, and now the cards have to fall as they may, Brad.
Yeah, indeed. And North Korea doesn't follow the dictates of Beijing or Moscow. It didn't even during the socialist camp. I mean, the DPRK does not have foreign soldiers on its soil, as South Korea does. So it's a fully sovereign country. Vladimir Putin said today they'd rather eat grass rather than give up their nuclear weapon system because they consider it to be an existential part of their very survival, given the fact that the United States is dedicated to carrying out regime change. That means, and we can see from the pattern, that no amount of economic sanctions will deter DPRK from doing what it's doing. The only thing that can change the game is for the U.S. to say, look, they're a nuclear power, but we don't want a war, so let's start talking, let's have bilateral negotiations.
So, Dan, it looks like the Trump administration is going to have to accept a nuclear North Korea. That seems as if that's the way this is going.
Well, I think if the embargo, which stops everything going in and out of the country, if the people have to start eating grass, as your other guest said, at some point in time, they're going to get tired of eating grass, and they themselves may stand up and say, enough is enough. I mean, they're already poor and hungry. I think that the most practical approach is an economic embargo. Forget about all the other sanctions. Just stop everything from going in or out of the country, and that may bring them to the table.
When you deprive 28 million people of food and medicine, when you use food and medicine as a weapon, it's a violation of international law. It's a crime against humanity. And secondly, it's an act of war. And so the DPRK will see that as an act of war.
And then when you said with their people, it's going to be sort of like giving them an excuse. And he could always go back to his people and say, see, this is exactly what they're doing to us. So it's going to be us versus them. They're already doing that
by denying those things to their people and feeding the military.
No. The U.S. imports $463 billion worth of products from China. China will not accept this. The United States cannot cut off economic relations with China, no matter what Donald Trump tweets about or whatever Mnuchin or what other cabinet officials have some fantasy that they can somehow bully China. In fact, that would be a catastrophe for the U.S. economy, and all politicians actually know that.
Okay, let's stop there regarding the DPRK and move on, if we may, to the other big story of the day, which for our viewers overseas is the big domestic story of the day. Everybody here is talking about it. And that's something called DACA, which stands for Deferred Action Childhood Arrivals, or the DREAM Act. And in one sentence, basically, young people who were brought here by their parents of a certain age have been granted the promise that they won't be deported over a certain time scale, and that has now been removed by the Trump administration. We'll just play Jeff Sessions, who is the Attorney General in the Trump administration. This is how he made the announcement, not the President, but how he made the announcement earlier today.
To have a lawful system of immigration that serves the national interest, we cannot admit everyone who would like to come here. It's just that simple. And that would be an open borders policy, and the American people have rightly rejected that. Therefore, the nation must set and enforce a limit on how many immigrants we admit each year, and that means all cannot be accepted.
Maria Pena, President Obama, in a very, very rare move since President Trump came to office, actually issued a statement on this today. And he basically said that what the Trump administration has done is wrong, self-defeating, and it is cruel. He said, and it is cruel. What do you think about what's been done?
Well, I think it's horrible. I mean, I personally have interviewed hundreds of dreamers, and I know their struggles, and I know, you know, what it's taken them to get to this point. You know, every study that I have seen points to their economic contributions. You know, they are actually in the military defending our country. They go to school. A lot of them graduate with top honors from American universities. They are here. You know, they're like the president and a lot of other Democrats and advocacy groups have said, they're American in every way except that they don't have legal papers. Yes. So what DACA did is it protected them from deportation on a temporary basis. So President Obama was saying today that he did it because Congress never acted on the DREAM Act or any immigration reform deal. So he didn't have a choice but to implement it through an executive authority, and he granted this temporary permit. What happened is that Trump comes in during the campaign trail. He promised a tough enforcement on immigration. He promised his base a massive deportation of all undocumented immigrants, including the Dreamers, including DACA. So then he put himself in a box because later on he realized that it's easier said than done. You know, how do you do this? How do you get rid of almost 1 million Dreamers who came here through no fault of their own? You know, it wasn't their decision. So then he modified his stance and said, Dreamers are terrific. We love them. We're going to create a solution with great heart. He repeated it again today. Yes. So now he's caught between a base that he promised to get rid of DACA, and then he also promised Dreamers a solution with great heart. Okay. So now he's set a final date, a cutoff date of March 5th, 2018, to give Congress a six-month window to pass an actual permanent solution through the legislative process to protect them on a permanent basis. We'll see if it's going to get done. I don't know. Of
course, to be fair, he could have just cut it off today. It could have ended today, and he didn't. He gave it a 6 months, and in some cases, depending on where you are in the system, maybe even a 2.5-year grace period. He could have ended it today, and he did not do that. He put it back to Congress, where it probably should be decided. Right?
Well, the problem is that not only did he, he could have cut it off on January 21st, and yet his administration kept renewing permits up until today. And so, you know, a lot of people, a lot of advocacy groups, that this is just a way to score political points with his base. And people are really very upset. You saw Dreamers walking off classrooms today across the U.S. You saw them at the gates of the White House. You saw the Democratic leadership, you know, promising to do everything they can to protect them. And it's a very thorny issue. I mean, immigration has always been a very thorny issue in the States.
Right. Dan, in Florida, this is 800,000 Dreamers that we're talking about here. Does this make the Republican Party look rather harsh, rather mean? And President Obama himself did say that it was cruel. It's very harsh work.
Well, maybe I should ask the question, was it cruel for the president to issue an executive order when the Congress, duly elected by the American people, said no? And so now we have a situation where the Congress, which has the responsibility for passing and setting immigration law, not the president. There are laws on the books that the Obama administration went around and created an executive order. If we're going to have a nation of laws, then we have to have the laws enforced. Okay. So it seems to me, while it's unfortunate these people came, they came over the last 8 years and more over administrations who refused to enforce the law.
Okay.
And can I
Jessica?
pick
It's
up on
actually
something
a
that
flawed
Dan...
argument because executive authorities have been used by Republican and Democratic presidents to bypass Congress. I mean, President Trump has signed a whole bunch of executive authorities that have bypassed Congress when it's up to them to make the laws.
To both of your points, too, Maria, I had a Department of Homeland Security official say on a call today that this is the first president in 4 presidents that has asked his law enforcement officers to enforce the law as written and not giving them a workaround. And that means Republicans and Democrats alike have been, you know, maneuvering around the existing law,
Because there's such a thing that's
right?
called prosecutorial discretion,
Right.
you know? When judges have it, immigration agents
But
have
the problem is it didn't solve the problem,
No,
right?
there
I
is
mean,
no
they never
prosecutorial
did
discussion.
get down
There
to
is no
passing a law
prosecutorial-
to have comprehensive immigration reform.
Go ahead, Dan.
If you have a law passed that says these are the rules of the road, you don't have prosecutorial discretion to enforce the federal law.
But there's
For you to decide that you're not going to
Immigration
enforce it
matters.
indicates that you don't have to pay attention or follow the federal statutes.
There's another way to look at it, which is how President Obama did look at it or presented for DACA and DAPA, which would be for their parents, which is there are 14 million undocumented people in the United States. You can't arrest all of them at once and prosecute them all at once and deport them all at once. You can make a priority list. So why would you take people who came here when they were 2 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old, have been here for 15 years, are in college or working or in the military? Why would you focus deportation on them? So he said, look, those are not the people we should be deporting. So the executive does have charge over ICE and over the implementation of these laws, he can implement it that way because you can't, quote, deport all 14 million people at once.
Let me try and just
you
advance
can
the
have-
story. Dan, let me try and advance the story a little bit if I can, because we have a situation where the president has thrown it back to the Congress now. They have 6 months to come up with a bill. They have elections coming up in late 2018. So let's assume that they do come up with a bill. And, you know, the theory is, Jessica Stone, White House correspondent, that when that bill is presented, the Republicans will add what Americans call pork to it. They will put things onto that bill, and one of those things could be the wall. We'll give you the Dreamers, you give us the wall.
Certainly that would make the president happy and the president's base happy, but I mean, I think we've got a long way to go before then. There's a lot of other vehicles for that wall to be attached to, most immediately funding the government, raising the debt ceiling, paying for the country's expenses. But I think, you know, it's interesting, the president allowed his Attorney General to make the announcement, even though he made the decision today. Yeah. So there's a lot of politics at play in very obvious ways in the way it was stage managed. But there's also the reality that he has people inside his own White House that don't agree with this decision and that are continuing to pressure him on the economics of it, because there are economic benefits to keeping these 800,000 people still working and going to school in the United States.
And Paul Ryan, the leading Republican in the House, who was against DACA, has now changed his position. Yes. He told President... and others. This means that the Republican Party, in spite of the fact that it wants to play to this kind of xenophobic campaign rally style, they also realize that there's going to be a lot of blowback, and I think the Republicans will be badly punished if they go through and take the DACA folks and drive them out. In other words, this could be a moment, actually, inexplicably, for Congress to actually do what it hasn't done over and over again, which is pass some sort of comprehensive immigration reform, because the Republicans, as a white party that's excluding brown people and black people, can't actually be a viable national party. They have only won one popular vote in the last 20 years. Donald Trump didn't win the popular vote. And they have to be able to broaden the tent of the Republican Party.
That's absolutely ludicrous.
John?
That's absolutely ludicrous.
The other thing is that, you know, when it comes to the Republican Party's image, if they're concerned about their image with the immigrant community, not just Hispanics, let me give you an example. When they lost the elections in 2012, I remember the autopsy that they came up with, and they pledged, I remember because I covered it, they pledged that they would do a renewed effort to do a broader outreach to the Hispanic community and other minorities. And yet what happened last year, you look at the platform that was approved during the convention. The platform, one of the items in the platform for the GOP was rescinding DACA. So how do you reconcile, on the one hand, you're trying to reach out to these voters that you want to win over, supposedly, but then you also call for rescinding DACA.
But this speaks to the divisions within the Republican Party, which, aside from the politics, which you guys are talking about, is also going to make it very difficult to pass comprehensive immigration reform on the right. We don't have divided government, and we still may not see a comprehensive immigration reform bill, which you could argue it may have the best chance yet. In fact, if it passes, it'll probably pass with a lot of Democrats. It might be a bipartisan effort that actually works.
Well, the Senate did pass an immigration package in 2013. It stalled in the House, you know, under GOP control, and it hasn't gone anywhere. So we'll see what happens now.
And I think it's worth making the point as well. It may be old history, but I think it's a point worth making that President Obama deported more people than any other president in recent history, didn't he? So his hands are not clean when it comes to this issue.
Well, his argument then, and even now, I guess, is that he did it because he was hoping to win over the tough, the tough GOP hardliners who were asking him to deport all those people. So he came up with the categories, you know, prioritizing those with criminal records, etc. So he was even by the advocacy groups even labeled him deporter-in-chief. So, and then, you know, the anger from progressive groups is that he did all this and yet got nothing for it.
Okay.
And I think that's the Democrats' big problem, always trying to find a compromise, a centrist position rather than a position of principle. Actually, right now, this could be turned around completely if people took a strong position based on principle. There are 14 million people here. The economy would sink without them. They need a path of legalization, a path towards a legal status.
And Dan, in Florida, the ball is now in the court of the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Time is not on anyone's side. The list of things to do for this Congress is enormous. There are only 12 days in September, for example, when they can operate, so time is running out. Do you think are they going to do it, do you think?
I don't know whether they're going to do it. I think we've got a situation where there are a lot of priorities. We've got to take care of the people in Texas. I live in South Florida, and I'm evacuating tomorrow because we have a Category 5 hurricane coming. So taking care of the American people is important. Getting a tax bill, trying to do something about Obamacare is important. I want to point out that we're talking about 800,000 Dreamers. That's a lot of people. But out of a population of 320 million, it isn't a lot of people.
And it's actually a lower number because DHS gave me an updated figure. The original DACA beneficiaries were 800,000, but between people getting their permits revoked or not renewed, plus those making adjustments, it's actually a little bit over 689,000.
All right, well, listen, we must end it there. But this, for our viewers overseas, is the big story of the day, and it's now a long-running story. We're going to be hearing about this till at least the end of the year, and probably a lot further. Dan, Brian, Maria, Jessica, thank you all.
So
we all enjoyed having you very much indeed. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm John Terrett, Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.